Law 3. Conceal your intentions. Keep people off balance and in the dark by never revealing the purpose behind your actions. If they have no clue what you are up to, they cannot prepare a defense. Guide them far enough down the wrong path, envelop them in enough smoke, and by the time they realize your intentions, it will be too late. Over several weeks, Ninon de l'Enclos, the most infamous courtesan of 17th century France, listened patiently as the Marquis de Sévigné explained his struggles in pursuing a beautiful but difficult young countess. Ninon was 62 at the time and more than experienced in matters of love. The Marquis was a lad of 22, handsome, dashing, but hopelessly inexperienced in romance. At first, Ninon was amused to hear him talk about his mistakes, but finally, she had had enough. Unable to bear ineptitude in any realm, least of all in seducing a woman, she decided to take the young man under her wing. First, he had to understand that this was war. The beautiful countess was a citadel, and he had to lay siege to her as carefully as any general would. Every step had to be planned and executed with the utmost attention to detail and nuance. Instructing the Marquis to start over, Ninon told him to approach the countess with a bit of distance, an air of nonchalance. The next time the two were alone together, she said, he would confide in the countess as a friend would, but not as a potential lover. This was to throw her off the scent. The countess was no longer to take his interest for granted. Perhaps he was only interested in friendship, but Ninon planned further ahead than that. Once the countess was confused, it would be time to make her jealous. At the next encounter, at a major celebration in Paris, the Marquis would show up with a beautiful young woman at his side. This woman had equally beautiful friends, so that wherever the countess would now see the Marquis, he would be surrounded by the most stunning young women in Paris. Not only would the countess be seething with jealousy, she would begin to see the Marquis as someone desired by others. It was difficult to make the Marquis understand this point, but Ninon patiently explained. A woman who is interested in a man wants to see that other women are interested in him too. Not only does that give him instant value, it makes it all the more satisfying to snatch him from their clutches. Once the countess was jealous but intrigued, it would be time to truly beguile her. On Ninon's instructions, the Marquis would fail to show up at events where the countess expected to see him. Then, suddenly, he would appear at salons he had never frequented before, but that the countess attended often. She would be unable to predict his moves. All of this would push her into the state of emotional confusion that is a prerequisite for successful seduction. These moves were executed, and they took several weeks. Ninon monitored the Marquis's progress through her network of acquaintances. She heard how the countess would laugh a little harder at his witticisms and listen more closely to his stories. She heard that the countess had begun asking questions about him. Her friends reported that at social gatherings, the countess would often look up at the Marquis and follow his every step. Ninon felt certain that the young woman was falling under his spell. It was a matter of weeks now, perhaps a month or two, but if all went smoothly, the citadel would fall. A few days later, the Marquis was at the countess's home. They were alone, and suddenly he became a different man. This time, acting on his own impulse, rather than following Ninon's careful instructions, he took the countess's hands and told her he was in love with her. The young woman seemed confused, a reaction he did not expect. She became polite, then excused herself. For the rest of the evening, she avoided his eyes and was not there to say goodnight when he left. The next few times he visited, he was told she was not at home. When she finally admitted him again, the two felt awkward and uncomfortable with each other. The spell was broken. Ninon de l'Enclos knew everything about the art of love. The greatest writers, thinkers, and politicians of the time had been her lovers, men like La Rochefoucauld, Molière, and Richelieu. Seduction was a game to her, to be practiced with skill. As she grew older and her reputation spread, the most important families in France would send their sons to her to be instructed in matters of love. Ninon knew that men and women are very different, but when it comes to seduction, they feel the same. Deep down, they often sense when they are being seduced, but they give in because they enjoy the feeling of being led along. It's a pleasure to let go and to allow another person to detour you into a strange and unfamiliar country. Everything in seduction, however, depends on suggestion. You cannot announce your intentions or reveal them directly in words. Instead, you must throw your targets off the scent. To surrender to your guidance, they must first be appropriately confused. You have to scramble your signals. Appear interested in another man or woman, using them as a decoy. Then hint at being interested in the target. Then feign indifference, and so on. Such patterns don't just confuse, they excite. Imagine the story from the Countess's perspective. After a few of the Marquis's moves, she sensed he was playing some sort of game. But the game delighted her. She didn't know where he was leading her, and so much the better. His moves intrigued her, each one keeping her waiting for the next. She even enjoyed her jealousy and confusion, because sometimes any emotion is better than the dull comfort of security. Perhaps the Marquis had ulterior motives. Most men do. But she was willing to wait and see. And probably, if she had been made to wait long enough, what he was ultimately up to would not have mattered at all. The moment the Marquis uttered that fatal word, love, however, everything changed. This was no longer a game with moves and mystery, it was an artless show of raw passion. His intention was revealed. He was seducing her. And that single revelation cast everything he had done in a new and unflattering light. All that had before seemed charming now seemed ugly and conniving. The Countess felt embarrassed and used. A door closed that would never open again. As Balthazar Gracian once wrote, "Do not be held a cheat, even though it is impossible to live today without being one. Let your greatest cunning lie in covering up what looks like cunning." In 1850, the young Otto von Bismarck, then a 35-year-old deputy in the Prussian parliament, stood at a turning point in his career. The great issues of the day were the unification of the many German states, including Prussia, and the question of war against Austria, the powerful neighbor to the south. Austria hoped to keep the Germans weak and divided, even threatening to intervene if they attempted to unite. Prince William, next in line to be Prussia's king, was in favor of going to war, and the parliament rallied eagerly to the cause. The only ones to oppose war were the reigning king, Frederick William IV, and his ministers, who preferred to appease the powerful Austrians. Throughout his career, Bismarck had been a loyal, even passionate supporter of Prussian might and power. He dreamed of German unification. He dreamed of going to war against Austria and humiliating the country that had for so long kept Germany divided. A former soldier, he saw warfare as a glorious and necessary business. This was, after all, the man who would later say, "The great questions of the time will be decided, not by speeches and resolutions, but by iron and blood." And yet, this passionate patriot and lover of military glory gave a speech in Parliament at the very height of war fever that astonished everyone who heard it. "Woe unto the statesman," he declared, "who makes war without a reason that will still be valid when the war is over. After the war, you will all look differently at these questions. Will you men have the courage to turn to the peasant contemplating the ashes of his farm, to the man who has been crippled, to the father who has lost his children?" Not only did Bismarck speak of the madness of this war, but, strangest of all, he praised Austria and defended her actions. This went against everything he had ever stood for. The consequences were immediate. Other deputies were deeply confused, and several of them changed their votes. Eventually, the king and his ministers won out, and war was averted. A few weeks after Bismarck's infamous speech, the king, grateful that he had spoken so forcefully for peace, made him a cabinet minister. A few years later, he became the Prussian premier, and from that position of power, he eventually led his country and a peace-loving king into a war against Austria, crushing the former empire and establishing a mighty German state, with Prussia firmly at its head. At the time of his speech in 1850, Bismarck had made several careful calculations. First, he sensed that the Prussian military, which had not kept pace with the rest of Europe, was not yet ready for war. Austria, in fact, might very well win, and that would be a disastrous result for the future he envisioned. Second, if the war were lost and Bismarck had publicly supported it, his career would be gravely jeopardized. The king and his conservative ministers wanted peace. Bismarck wanted power. The answer was to throw everyone off the scent, to support a cause he privately detested, and to say things he would have laughed at if spoken by another man. And an entire country was fooled. It was precisely because of that speech that the king made him a minister, a position from which he rose swiftly to become prime minister. From there, he attained the power to strengthen the Prussian military and accomplish everything he had wanted all along: the humiliation of Austria and the unification of Germany under Prussia's leadership. Bismarck was certainly one of the cleverest statesmen who ever lived, a true master of strategy and deception. No one suspected what he was really up to. Had he announced his true intentions, arguing openly that it was better to wait now and fight later, he would not have won the argument. Most Prussians wanted war at that moment, and they mistakenly believed their army was superior. Had he played up to the king, openly asking to be made a minister in exchange for supporting peace, that too would have failed. The king would have distrusted his ambition and doubted his sincerity entirely. But by being completely insincere, by sending deliberately misleading signals, he deceived everyone, concealed his true purpose, and in the end attained everything he wanted. Such is the power of hiding your intentions.